The drive home from Greenwood Cemetery takes 40 minutes if you go the back way through Renfrew County, and I remember thinking, as I turned off the highway, that I should stop and get gas. That was the kind of thought I was having. Gas. Not that my husband of 26 years had just watched his father lowered into the frozen January ground without crying once. Not that my brother-in-law had spent the entire reception at the church hall talking to a man I didn't recognize, a man in a very good coat who kept checking his watch. Just gas, because the tank was low and I didn't want to be stranded on a county road in -15. My father-in-law, Norman, had lived with us for 9 years. 9 years. I want you to understand what that means before I tell you anything else, because I think people hear a number like that and I picture something manageable. A spare bedroom, Sunday dinners, maybe helping an old man with his coat. That is not what 9 years looked like in our house. Norman came to live with us in the February after his wife, my mother-in-law Eleanor, passed. He was 78 then, still sharp, still the kind of man who did the crossword in pen and had opinions about everything from the CBC to the proper way to make a ruse. He was not an easy man to love. He was stubborn and proud, and he had spent most of my husband's childhood working long weeks at the mill in Pembroke, while my mother-in-law held everything together at home. He and I had never been particularly close, but Eleanor had been kind to me. And when she was gone, and Norman was alone in that big house on Opengo Line with no one to check whether he'd eaten, I was the one who said we should bring him to us, my husband. I'll call him my husband because after everything that happened, I can't quite say his name with neutrality yet, thought it was a good idea. His brother Terence, who lives in Mississauga and calls twice a year at Christmas and on their father's birthday, also thought it was a good idea. From a distance of 600 kilometres, it's easy to think things are a good idea. The first 2 years were fine, actually. Norman ate with us, watched the 6 o'clock news, complained about the government. My kids were teenagers then, still at home, and he softened around them in a way he never quite softened around adults. I'd find him teaching my daughter cribbage at the kitchen table, or explaining to my son how to change the oil in a car. Those were good years. I'd be lying if I said there was nothing good. But then he had the first fall. His hip. And after the surgery, something shifted, not just physically, but in him. He got quieter. He'd lose words mid-sentence. He started asking about Eleanor as though she was still alive, and there was a particular kind of ache in being the person who had to remind him, gently, again and again, that she was gone. Every time felt like the first time for him. For me, it was the 100th. By the time he was 82, he had a formal diagnosis: vascular dementia. Not Alzheimer's, the neurologist was careful to explain, but the progression could be similar. He would have good days and very bad days, and over time there would be more bad ones. I sat in that office in Ottawa, taking notes on a yellow legal pad, while my husband sat beside me checking his phone. I need to be precise here, because I know what it sounds like when a woman in her 60s tells a story like this. It sounds like grievance. Like a list of wrongs kept for years, pulled out now for dramatic effect. I don't want it to sound like that. I want it to sound like what it actually was, which is ordinary life, ordinary erosion, the kind that doesn't announce itself until one day you realize you haven't slept a full night in 4 months, because you're listening for sounds from the room down the hall. I had been a nurse, 31 years, at Pembroke Regional. I took early retirement when Norman's care got to the point where leaving him alone in the house wasn't safe anymore. My husband's salary covered us, technically, but technically is a word that hides a lot. Terence visited once a year, at most. He would come for 4 or 5 days, take Norman to Tim Hortons, watch a hockey game, and leave having done the kind of caregiving that lets you sleep at night. I don't say this entirely without bitterness. I've tried to understand it. Some people are just not built for the slow work of it, the daily showing up. Some people need to believe that because they sent money at Christmas and called on Sundays, they've done their part. Maybe Terence genuinely believed that. Maybe it was easier to believe it from Mississauga. Norman got worse slowly, then faster, the way these things tend to go. By his mid-80s, he needed help with everything: dressing, bathing, keeping track of his medications, understanding where he was. There were nights he was convinced he was back in the mill, and he'd be up at 3 in the morning, agitated, calling out for co-workers who'd been dead for 20 years. I learned how to bring him back. I learned what tone of voice, what words, what I could touch, and what I couldn't. I learned the geography of his confusion, the way you learn any difficult terrain. Not because you wanted to, but because you had to live in it. My husband was there. I want to be fair, he helped when he was home. But he worked long weeks, and he travelled for work, and the weight of the household, and the care and the managing of everything that comes with having a person with dementia in your home, the medical appointments, the prescriptions, the dealing with the LHI about home support hours, the paperwork, the endless paperwork, most of that was mine. I had built my retirement around it. I had organised my entire life around it. Norman knew. That's the thing I keep coming back to. Even in his last years, even on the days when he didn't know what month it was, or whether Eleanor was alive, or whether my husband was his son or someone he'd worked with at the mill. Even then there were windows, clear ones. He'd look at me sometimes with complete recognition. The old Norman, the crossword in pen Norman, and he'd say something quiet and direct, something that told me he'd been paying attention underneath the fog. About 14 months before he died, he asked me to sit with him one afternoon while my husband was at work. We were in the sunroom, the one that gets the west light in winter, and he had a mug of tea and I had coffee, and he was having a very good day, clearer than he'd been in weeks. He told me that he knew what kind of man his son was. He said it simply, without drama, the way old men sometimes say the hardest things, because they've run out of time to approach them carefully. He said he knew how the years had gone. He said Eleanor had loved me. He said he was sorry it had taken him so long to say that himself. I didn't know what to do with that. I just held his hand and we sat in the westlight for a while. He died in the first week of January. A stroke, quick, at home. He was 87. By the end, he had been largely unreachable for months, and his death was in some ways a mercy. And I'm allowed to say that because I was the one who was there. The funeral was on a Thursday. The ground was hard and they had to use equipment to open it. I stood at the graveside in my good wool coat and thought about the 14 years since Eleanor had died, the 9 years of Norman in our house, the 4 years of serious daily caregiving at the end. I thought about my nursing career, the pension I had taken early, the colleagues I'd lost touch with. I thought about the woman I was when Eleanor first got sick and called me from the hospital in Renfrew because she didn't want to worry my husband at work, and how I had driven 45 minutes to sit with her through the diagnosis because she asked me to and because I loved her. I thought about how far away all of that felt. I didn't cry at the graveside. I think I'd already done most of my grieving in the years before. The slow kind, the kind you do at 3 in the morning in the hallway outside a confused old man's room. We drove home separately. I don't remember exactly why. Something about the flowers. My husband and Terence left together, and I said I'd follow. I stopped for gas. When I got home, there was a car in the driveway I didn't recognise. Silver. Ontario plates. I thought it was one of the neighbours coming to drop food off. People in Renfrew County still do that, bring food after funerals. I was grateful for it. It was not a neighbour. My husband was in the living room. Terence was there. And there was a man I had never seen before, seated in the good chair by the front window, with a briefcase open on his knee. He was younger than I expected, maybe 40, in a dark suit that was too thin for Canadian January. He stood when I came in, which I remember noticing. He introduced himself. A lawyer from an Ottawa firm I'd never heard of. I still had my coat on. I hadn't put down my purse. My husband told me to sit down. I didn't sit. I just stood there in my coat with my purse on my arm, in my own living room, in the house I had managed and cleaned and organised and worried over for 26 years. And I looked at the 3 of them, and I understood. In that particular way, women sometimes understand things before they've been told, that something was about to happen to me. The lawyer explained that Norman had revised his will approximately 14 months prior. The Opiongo Lime property, the house Norman had bought with Eleanor in 1971, the one they'd raised their boys in, the one that had been in the back of everyone's mind as an inheritance since Eleanor died, went to my husband and Terence jointly. Norman's investment accounts, a modest amount, split between them. Personal effects to be divided by the family. There was a bequest to me, $10,000, for my years of care and service to the family. He used those words, service to the family. I remember the sound of my own breathing. My husband didn't look at me. He was looking at the floor, at a particular spot on the hardwood, and I knew him well enough to know that this was not new information for him. He had known, maybe not for 14 months, but he had known before today. Terence cleared his throat. He said they thought, given everything, given the assets and the way things had fallen out, it might make sense for me to find my own place. Give everyone space to process. He actually said that. Space to process. I was 63 years old. I had walked away from a nursing career. I had 9 years of my life in the walls of the house I was standing in, and my brother-in-law was talking to me about space to process as though I had simply dropped by for a difficult conversation, and now it was time for me to go home. I looked at my husband. He finally looked up. He said he was sorry. He said it wasn't personal. He said the house was his father's to leave to whomever he chose. He wasn't wrong, technically. That word again. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I'm sure they expected one or the other, and I'm sure my stillness unsettled them a little, and I will admit that part of me was glad for that. I set my purse down on the hall table. I took off my coat. I folded it over my arm. I said I needed a few days. The lawyer said, of course, and began explaining something about timelines, and I stopped listening. I walked down the hall to the spare bedroom, the one that had been Norman's for 9 years, and I sat on the edge of the bed that still smelled faintly of him, and I put my hands in my lap, and I looked at the window, and I thought about what to do next. I was not, despite what they might have hoped, without resources. There is something that happens to women who spend decades in nursing. You learn to function in crisis. You learn to separate the immediate from the important. You learn that panic is a luxury, and that the person who stays calm in the room is the one who actually helps. I had spent 31 years becoming very good at that. I was not going to unlearn it now, in this room, on this night. I had a good friend, Patricia, who had been a family law paralegal for 20 years before she retired to Ampria. I called her that night. She was at my door by 9 the next morning with a pot of coffee and the name of a lawyer in Renfrew. Here is what Patricia explained to me, sitting at the kitchen table while my husband was out, which is what I need you to understand. Before I tell you the rest, I had rights. The house was marital property under Ontario's Family Law Act. My husband could not simply receive an inheritance and then remove me from the matrimonial home, not legally. The fact that a will left assets to him did not dissolve my rights as his spouse. The $10,000 bequest was Norman's to give or not give, but the living situation, that was a different matter entirely. My husband and Terence had apparently gotten some advice, but not enough of it. I met with the lawyer in Renfrew the next afternoon, a woman named, well, she asked me not to use her name, so I won't, a woman about 50, very direct, who laid out my position in language so clear it almost felt like a kindness. I had a claim on the matrimonial home. I had a potential claim for spousal support given my years of foregone income. I had documentation, years of it, the medical records, the care notes I'd kept out of old nursing habit, the appointment books, the correspondence with the L.H. Hine, a journal I had never intended anyone to read, that established in considerable detail exactly what I had contributed to this family. I had not kept the journal as evidence. I had kept it to stay sane, but it was very useful as evidence. I should tell you about the envelope. In the last clear weeks before the dementia took Norman almost entirely, back when he was still having occasional good days, he had given me a small white envelope, sealed. He told me to keep it somewhere my husband wouldn't find it, and he said it with a clarity that I recognized immediately as intentional. He was having a window. He knew what he was saying. I put it in the zippered inner pocket of my old nursing bag that's been sitting in the back of the bedroom closet for 4 years. My husband has never opened that bag in his life. I had not opened the envelope either. Norman told me not to open it until after everything was settled. Those were his exact words. Until after everything is settled. I had respected that. I don't entirely know why. Maybe because I trusted him. Maybe because I was afraid of what was in it. Maybe because in a life where I'd spent years managing other people's difficult truths, I'd learned that sometimes you have to wait for the right moment to receive information. I opened it on the fourth night, after I'd already met with a lawyer, after the situation had become clear to me legally, after I'd made the decision I'd made. There was a letter, 3 pages, handwritten, in Norman's careful script. The same hand that used to do the crossword in pen, shaky now but still precise. And a photocopy of a document I hadn't known existed. Norman had purchased a small property in Cobden, a 2-bedroom bungalow on the edge of town, bought quietly about 2 years before he came to live with us, when Eleanor was still alive and he'd been thinking, apparently, about what the future might hold. Eleanor had known about it. Norman wrote that Eleanor had said, toward the end, that she hoped he'd find a way to make sure I was all right. He put the Cobden property in a trust. I was the beneficiary. He had arranged it so that it would transfer to me upon his death without going through probate, without appearing in the will, without Terence or my husband knowing it existed. He had done this with a different lawyer, in Renfrew, someone who'd known Eleanor's family for decades. He'd done it 2 years before the dementia started taking him, while he was still fully competent to make decisions. His letter explained all of this carefully. He explained why he'd revised his will the way he had, because he knew, he said, that if he left anything substantial to me directly, my husband would contest it, would create legal trouble, would use the family money to fight it. He didn't want to leave me a battlefield. He wanted to leave me a house. He also wrote this, that in all his years he had met very few people willing to show up for the hard work of loving someone. That I had shown up for Eleanor, and then for him, without being asked, without being paid, without making it about what I would receive. He said he had not always been a good father or a good man, but that he understood, in the years I cared for him, what it looked like when someone chose to be good. He said he hoped the house was enough to start something new. I sat on the floor of Norman's old room and read those 3 pages 4 times. I stayed in the house for another 6 weeks while things were sorted. My husband and I spoke very little. He hired a family law lawyer when he understood what my position actually was, and we began the work. It is work, the slow, expensive, grinding work of dissolving a marriage. I didn't fight for the matrimonial home. I didn't want it. I wanted out. The Cobden property was mine free and clear. The trust documents were in order. My lawyer reviewed everything and confirmed it. There was nothing to contest. Norman had been careful. Patricia drove me to Cobden on a Saturday in March, when the snow was starting to melt at the edges of things. That particular late winter grey-brown that means spring is eventually coming whether you believe in it or not. The bungalow was small, smaller than I'd lived in for most of my adult life. It had a decent kitchen and south-facing windows, and a backyard with an old apple tree. The previous tenant had left a welcome mat at the back door that said something cheerful. I stood in the kitchen on the first day with Patricia, and we drank coffee out of paper cups, because I hadn't unpacked anything yet, and I looked out at the apple tree, and I cried for the first time in a long time, not because I was unhappy, because I'd been so clenched for so long that the unclenching felt like something I hadn't earned yet, but was receiving anyway. I called my daughter that night. She had known something was wrong for a long time, I think, without knowing exactly what. She cried when I told her about the house and the letter. She said she was coming to visit as soon as the roads were clear. She said she was proud of me, and I told her I wasn't sure I'd done anything particularly proud-worthy. And she said, "Mom, you held everything together for 9 years without complaining once, and then you walked away with your dignity, and that counts for something." Maybe it does. I don't know what to say about Norman even now. He was not a gentleman, and he was not easy to care for, and in his best years he had not been particularly kind to his family. But in his last years, in the long, slow dissolution of everything else, something in him became very honest. He could not have given me the house when he was healthy. It would have been a statement, a gesture, a disruption. But in the way he arranged it, quietly, years in advance, before the fog came down, there was a kind of love in that. The slow, practical, undemonstrative kind. The kind that doesn't say much but makes sure the tank is full before you drive away. I have been in Cobden for 3 months now. I have unpacked everything. I have put a bird feeder in the backyard near the apple tree, and 2 chickadees and 1 very territorial nuthatch have already found it. My daughter visited for a long weekend, and we made soup and watched old movies and slept in, and none of it was complicated. I am 63 years old, and I am beginning again. And I won't pretend that's not frightening sometimes. Late at night, when the house makes the sounds new houses make, and the dark outside is very quiet. But there is also this. I wake up in the morning, and the day is mine. Just mine. I make coffee, and I stand at the south window, and I watch the light come up over the fields. And I think about Eleanor telling Norman she hoped he'd make sure I was all right. And I think about Norman sitting in the sunroom with me in the west light, holding my hand, saying he was sorry it had taken him so long. It was enough. In the end, it was more than enough. I've thought a lot about why Norman did what he did the way he did it. He could have told me directly. He could have warned me. He could have made a scene of it, called my husband into the room, and said plainly what he thought of how things had gone. He didn't do any of that. He made quiet arrangements, years in advance, and then he trusted me to find them when I needed them. There's something in that I'm still turning over. I think about the choices I made over those 9 years, not the big ones, but the small daily ones, staying up through the bad nights, learning which words brought him back when he was lost, writing everything down, not because I thought anyone would ever read it, but because it felt like the honest thing to do. None of those choices were made with any expectation of reward. I want to be clear about that. I didn't care for Norman so that something good would come back to me. I cared for him because Eleanor had loved me, and because he was a person who needed care, and because I had the knowledge and the capacity to give it. That's all. But I've come to believe that how we act when no one is watching, when there's no audience, no recognition, no obvious payoff, is actually the most important thing about us. It shapes us. It shapes the people around us too, even when we don't realize they're paying attention. Norman was paying attention. Even through the fog, even in the years when he couldn't reliably remember my name, something in him had registered the truth of what was happening in that house. And when he had his windows of clarity, he used them to do something about it. That kind of integrity, the quiet, unwitnessed kind, is not something you can fake over 9 years. You either have it or you don't, and if you have it, it's because you built it slowly, decision by decision, in the ordinary moments of an ordinary life. The practical intelligence mattered too. Patricia showing up with coffee and a lawyer's name, me knowing enough from years of working in healthcare to have kept records, the document trail that already existed, because I'd been doing the job properly, not because I anticipated needing to defend myself. I've thought about what would have happened if I'd panicked instead of going quiet that night in Norman's old room. If I'd reacted from hurt instead of thinking clearly. The outcome could have been very different. Clear thinking in hard moments is something I had to learn, and I'm glad I'd learned it before I needed it. And then there is the matter of simply not giving up. Getting in the car and driving to Renfrew. Sitting across from a lawyer and telling the story straight. Making the decision to start over at 63 in a small bungalow in Cobden with a south-facing window and an apple tree I didn't plant. None of that was easy. Easy would have been accepting the $10,000 and the story my husband had already written for me. There is a version of this where I do that. I understand why some women do. The weariness alone, after 9 years of caregiving, is enough to make you want to just lie down and let things be decided for you. I didn't, and I think Norman knew I wouldn't. I think that's part of why he trusted me with the envelope. I am not the same person I was when Eleanor first called me from that hospital in Renfrew. I am older and more tired in some ways and more clear-eyed in others. I know what I'm worth in a way I didn't at 40. I know what I can carry and what I don't have to carry anymore. The chickadees found the feeder this morning, two of them, the same two, I think, working through the sunflower seeds with tremendous focus. I watched them for a while before I made coffee. Norman would have liked that, I think. He always noticed birds.